Eddie Shore was a feisty loner who took up hockey as a career after his father literally gambled away the family's Manitoba farm.
You know, you got to realize one thing about Eddie Shore. Eddie Shore was probably hated in every arena except Boston. And people only hate the great players. And he was one of the greats. I don't care what they say, whether they didn't like him. He had something about him that even if you knew nothing about hockey and you went to a game, you'd say, there's the guy that stands out. And it was just the way he took charge of everything. He was in control. He was the Bobby Orr of his day.
Eddie Shore joined the Boston Bruins in 1926, and for 14 years was one of the stalwarts of the team's defense. Aggressive and controversial, Shore was one of the early rushing defensemen who could bring the fans to their feet.
Probably as good a defenseman as ever played in the league.
In addition, Shore saw himself as Boston's sage and elder statesman, and rookies would be left in no doubt about that.
You just shaking your boots when the great Shore came over to say something to you. Mr. Schmidt. It wasn't Milt or Conrad, my second name. It was Mr. all the time. Or, if he didn't have time to say Mr., it would be Joe. So, I skated over there. I says, yes, Eddie. He says, let me tell you something, son. He says, your days in the National Hockey League will be numbered if you do not change your style of skating. I says, Eddie, I'm 19 years of age. I says, how am I going to change now? He says, you will change or you will not last.
Always a hard taskmaster, Eddie Shore would have liked his teammates to come out of a mold fashioned in his own image. He had good reason to be conceited. On ice, his talent was undeniable. 4 times he was judged the most valuable player in the NHL. And off the ice, the fans adored him. But sadly, what many would remember most about Boston's favorite son was what Eddie Shore would rather forget. The night in Boston Garden in 1933 that he lost his temper with the Maple Leafs' leading scorer, Irving Ace Bailey.
He rushed over at Bailey, who was standing beside me in the defense, and he flipped Bailey just like a rag doll. Bailey came down his head and had a concussion, and face turned blue. And I looked at Bailey and I thought to myself, he can't get away with this. So I skated up and probably called him a few names, and I hung one on him, and he went down. So we had Bailey in one end of the rink down and Shore in the other. It was a serious thing. If Bailey had died, Shore would have been charged with manslaughter.
Ace Bailey had played his last game of hockey. An all-star benefit match was held for him in Toronto. Eddie Shore was on the ice to play that night. He skated up to Ace and extended his hand. The crowd fell silent. But when Ace shook the Bruins' hand, they rose to their feet and cheered the act of public forgiveness. Eddie Shore played 7 more seasons before retiring with his second Stanley Cup in 1940. But the memory of Bailey would haunt him the rest of his days. However, he invested his savings in a small professional team, the Springfield Indians, where he'd be owner, manager, coach, and player. And it was here that his eccentricities would become legendary.
When Eddie Shore owned the Springfield Indians, that was purgatory for any hockey player who wasn't in the National Hockey League and Shore could get his hands on.
At one time, he not only owned the team, his wife sold the tickets. Eddie would go and get dressed for the game, put on his hat and his overcoat, and go out, and he would take the tickets as they were coming in. And when the referee blew his whistle on the ice to start the game, Eddie would take off his coat and his hat and skate out to center ice. And the players had to paint the boards. They sold hot dogs and popcorn and everything. Everybody worked in that organization.
Jake Milford, who had been the general manager of the Vancouver Canucks, earlier had been a player for Eddie Shore's Springfield Indians, and he was traded to Buffalo. And when he got there on the overnight train from wherever, he bought the morning paper, the Buffalo Courier Express, and he turned to the sport page to see who won the hockey games. And to his surprise, he discovered that he had been traded for 2 hockey nets. He said that that part was bad enough. He knew Shore was a little eccentric, but the thing that really bothered him was that Shore was outraged because he thought he traded for 2 new nets, and it turned out that Buffalo had just sent him 2 old ones.
He was something else. You had to know him to believe some of the things that he would do.
I would have loved to have been 16 years old and have Eddie Shore, who everybody hated, take me and mold me into a hockey player, because it's Eddie Shore's style of hockey that the Russians copied. That's exactly what he was teaching 50 years ago. And the Russians took it, perfected it, and came over and beat us.